I'm getting an opportunity to talk to folks who really know a lot about this subject. I was telling Erwin just before we started that normally I have to start out this talk by just explaining the basics of what cacti are, that there is even a thing called illegal trade in cacti, and that cacti are some of the most threatened plants on the planet. But I get to skip over some of that today. So yeah, again, my name is Jared Margulies, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Alabama. And I'm going to talk about both some ongoing research on illicit cactus and succulent trade, but also from my book. This is what it looks like. You can buy it all over the place. It's published, it's The Cactus Hunters, Desire and Extinction in Illicit Succulent Trade. It's published with the University of Minnesota Press. I think it retails for about 20, 21 to $24 in paperback. So let's get started. And I'm going to start by explaining how I got into this subject. And this is basically to say that my background in terms of the kind of research I've done before, my PhD work was on the social dimensions and politics of human-wildlife conflicts between animals and people in South India. So a really far cry from the world of cactus and succulent trade. And that work was really focused again on, issues between agrarian farmers and tigers and leopards and elephants and what happens when elephants raid a farmer's crops or tigers kill people's cows and how this matters for conservation. So I came from a background of conservation politics, more broadly speaking. And then I applied and had the opportunity to receive a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Sheffield in the Department of Politics and International Relations on a project about illegal wildlife trades. And originally, I was supposed to study the illegal trade in tiger bones from India to China, building on my past research in India. I had some concerns about how that work would actually unfold, how I was going to keep research participants safe through that research. And so one of the oh, I'm sorry. I'm seeing a note that someone says you're showing presenter view instead of full screen view. Um, is that, hold on, let me stop and see if we can get this working. I guess the lack of chat is making things a little bit more complicated today. Um,
I think that's in your,
yeah. Are you seeing the right version now?
yes.
Fabulous. Thank you for letting me know. Sorry about that, folks. Um, so, anyways, long story short, I was sort of searching around for a different topic to study besides the illegal trade in tiger bones. And one day, before this work started back in 2016, I um, I came across an article on saguaro rustling in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. And as folks on this call know, this is something that dates back decades, right? People poaching saguaros from both Mexico and Arizona for the landscape architectural trade. This dates back decades. But I had never heard about this, and I thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to know more about it and why it was happening. And this quickly led me down a sort of rabbit hole to to investigating all of these news articles I was finding about decades of illegal harvesting and wild collection and illegal trade in cacti. And I thought it was really fascinating that I had never heard about this. And then I was also reading more about just how threatened a lot of the cactus family was. And so again, I come to this research as a social scientist, not a botanist or a cactus expert, but as you can see from my background, and a few props that I'll bring into the screen from time to time, I quickly became fascinated by both the people who were really desirous of these plants, but also the plants themselves. Um, and so quite quickly, I realized that not only was this a major issue that was affecting cactus around the world, but also that there was no really rigorous social science research that had been conducted to better understand why did this illegal trade exist, what was underpinning it, what was the motivating factors for individuals involved in taking these plants and then sending them around the world. And what also could be done about it? And what can we learn about illegal wildlife trades more broadly through the study of illegal cactus and succulent trade? So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, which I normally would have to talk more about with folks. But as everyone I think probably on this call is deeply aware, cacti are one of the most threatened taxonomic groups of any assessed species of animal or plant globally. And that's based on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. Almost a third of all 1,500 recognized species of cacti are classified as threatened. And some 86% of threatened cacti are used for horticultural purposes that are also extracted from wild populations. These are threatened cacti that come from hotspots all over the Americas. And one of the primary resource or uses of these plants is for the horticultural trade in the collection of cacti, right? So we have one of the most threatened taxa of plants on the planet, and one of the major drivers of that threatened status is their demand in horticultural trades, while also recognizing, of course, that both climate change and habitat degradation and habitat loss loom large. As I was getting into this research, though, an interesting thing happened was that suddenly it seemed like there was a lot more media attention being drawn to this form of illegal wildlife trade. This is a major article that I think probably a lot of people here are familiar with, written by Rachel Newer in the New York Times. But it wasn't just restricted to cacti, and it was across the sort of a variety of kinds of succulents that we were finding suddenly a lot of attention in the media being paid to illegal cactus and succulent trade um, across all different kinds of species. And this was sort of happening as I was conducting this research, and suddenly there was a bit of a shift that whereas before there really hadn't been a lot of major media attention to this topic while people in the cactus and succulent communities were aware of it, suddenly, The Guardian, the New York Times, the LA Times were writing about this sort of seemingly growing new threat. And I was curious about that. One, why was it sort of being framed as a new thing? Was it really new, or was it something that simply was getting more attention? But also, was this simply a matter of the basics of economics and supply and demand that would help us understand illegal wildlife trade in cactus and succulent plants, or was there something else going on? And the reason I say that is because in my past research on human-wildlife conflicts, a lot of my focus in theoretical frameworks focused on issues of the economy and political economy in particular. How contestations between agrarian communities and wildlife conservation often had to do with reproductions of social inequalities, marginalization, and poverty. And so I wondered, is that simply the story here too, that the reason that this illegal wildlife trade exists is because of money? And very quickly, what I came to see was that there was something else I felt happening here, that there was more to this story than simply opportunities for profit. That, as sort of Irwin touched upon, there was something else kind of moving people out into the wild to look at plants, but also for some people, interrelations that were harming species, namely by taking wild harvested plants. This also left me as an academic wondering where the sort of intellectual gap was, so to speak, in this work. What was I going to be spending the next 5 years sort of deeply immersed in and theorizing and thinking about? So where I started with a sort of just series of sort of naive questions about why would people steal cacti or illegally trade them, what I quickly found was a need to think about desire. And so one of the key things that I do in my book is try to develop a framework for thinking more deeply about what desire is, and how paying attention to desire can help us better understand on a more foundational level why it might be that people who seemingly love these plants the most, right? Really passionate collectors and hobbyists, like a lot of the folks on the call today probably, were also engaged in activities that threaten the flourishing of these species in the world. It seemed to me like a really fascinating kind of set of contradictions. And so part of what I want to do in this talk is kind of show you how, as someone not as a cactus person who has become one through this research, but as a social scientist, how I became both enraptured with these plants and the people who moved into new kinds of social relationships with them, but why it would be that, right, that people who seemingly love these plants the most might be engaged in activities that actually harm their ability to live in the world in perpetuity, and actually, at the most extreme level, actually engage in activities that threaten them with extinction, their total absence from the world. Okay. And one of the ways of thinking about this comes to this quote that I have here that was said to me by a British cactus collector in doing this research. Most of us will be quite happy with a cultured or grafted plant, but there will always be those who want the real thing. And I want to sit with that a question of what is the real doing in this sentence when this person said this? What is the real? What makes a plant out in habitat seemingly more real than a cultivated plant in the greenhouse? What underpins that fantasy? And what can we do with that fantasy? What can we do to reorient it towards more ethical approaches to collection and actually caring for plants? And so I like to frame this research in my book as a study of plant people, or a dedication to the hyphen between plants and people. And so during my research with cactus and succulent collectors, one research participant described his community as plant people. And so I think one way to think about my book is a dedication to that hyphen, what both connects and separates the collector from the plants that serve as objects of desire. And so one of the things I really needed to do then in this book is think about these, what I would call more than human relationships. So these relationships that extend beyond just the human realm, but for instance, as depicted in this image of Alberto Wojciech Fritsch, a very famous Czech botanist, ethnologist, and cactus lover, and cactus hunter, who I write about in chapter 3 of the book. What is it that ties the passionate collector to these plants? And what does it do in moving them into new relations? So just to summarize kind of by the numbers, what I then spent many years of my life doing, starting in this postdoc, but then moving into my position at UA in Tuscaloosa. I conducted over 100 qualitative interviews with conservationists, botanists, cactus collectors, hobbyists, law enforcement agents, and other relevant stakeholders. I reviewed hundreds of pages of court records and cases related to illegal plant trade. I conducted multiple weeks of in-depth participatory observation, or we could think of ethnography, on what people sometimes call cacto exploration trips. So going with passionate hobbyists on field trips to see plants in habitat and to take photographs of them. I participated and engaged in dozens of Cactus Club meetings and conventions and events. I joined the British Cactus and Succulent Society through the Sheffield chapter. And in the end, this research was conducted in 7 countries on 4 continents. And one of the reasons was that theoretically, I was motivated by this idea of what we could call following the species or following the thing, and that I literally wanted to connect and look at these plants in these different locations. How do these plants, from say the Atacama Desert end up in these different places in the world, and like follow them quite literally. And so this work took me everywhere from Europe and the US, eventually to South Africa, but also to South Korea and Mexico and Brazil. In addition, during the pandemic, when I was no longer able to travel, I also conducted an online survey of close to 500 cactus and succulent collectors and hobbyists, primarily in the US and Europe. I'm going to report some of those findings here today. And I think that's important. These results were published in the journal Conservation Biology just this past year, but many of the people on the call may have actually participated in that survey. I was on this call, on this seminar a couple of years ago where John Redman gave a great presentation on the flora of Baja, and I offered a link so that people could take this survey. So many of you may have taken that survey, which is great. And I want to thank you so much for your time in doing that. So this work took me into a lot of different kinds of spaces as well, where people connect with these plants, from extraordinary collections of cacti in greenhouses in places like Czechia, or the Czech Republic, or the UK, or the US, to partaking in cacto exploration in places like Brazil, to engaging in activities that a lot of hobbyists, such as many people on this call and now me as well, partake in, such as practicing macro scale photography. I'm not, this is very much amateur work. I'm not as professional as, say, Erwin is. His work humbles me, but it was a good opportunity for me to really try to understand the hobby and what motivated people in these pursuits. I also conducted what a scholar, Theo Balvet, has called investigative ethnography. And this is sort of a blending of what we could think of as investigative journalism. So for instance, fact-finding and truth-seeking through, for instance, paying attention to criminal records and court records related to incidents of illegal wildlife trade and illegal cactus and succulent trade, but then taking a critical approach to it and not necessarily only being interested in what was the quote unquote truth, but also how did people discursively understand and make sense of what was happening. So when I say discursively here, what I sort of mean is how did people construct narratives about these trades that were about more than just sort of what actually was happening, but how people interpreted them. Just to share a little bit about some of the geography and demographics that came out of this research, one of the clear things that comes out of this book is that illegal cactus trade is truly global in scope. I realize that many people, if not most people on this call, are already aware of that. But this is not a trade that is only restricted to very particular localities of where plants come from or destinations in terms of demand. My book is therefore especially focused on demand centered in the US, Europe, and East Asia as hotspots of demand. But I critically wanted to focus away only from talking about East Asia as a recognized demand center, because many people on this call will be familiar with, as much as there's a lot of attention put on East Asian collection right now in various forms of illegal wildlife trade, a lot of this illegal wildlife trade is happening here at home in the US or in the UK or in Europe. And I thought it was really important to pay attention to that dynamic. And one of the reasons for that is there's a real bias in conservation research that overemphasizes, I would argue, only looking at demand centered in East Asia, when actually the world's largest consuming region of illegal wildlife trade products is Europe. And the US is close behind alongside China. So there's a clear, strong demand for illegal trade in plants from global north countries. This includes cacti and succulents. It's not just a story about China. And today in European and North American contexts, where a lot of my research was focused, we find an interesting tendency where more men are more likely to only collect cacti, while more women are more likely to collect only succulents. Now, the majority of people collect both, and we don't find gender distinctions there. The reason I mention this is not because there's anything normal about that or fixed about it, but it is interesting to see that in certain ways, plant collection is gendered, but that doesn't mean there's a fixity in those gendered relationships. Historically, in fact, this was otherwise, and I'm going to show you an example of what I mean by that. And so one of the things that was unexpected in this research was that I ended up spending time paying attention to things like gender, race, and geography in terms of who was involved in different kinds of trades and why. So actually more men, for instance, than women we found from our survey research were more likely to break the law in terms of illegally trading in plants than women. And that's an interesting thing to think about. But I want to just give you a flavor and example of how I also looked back into history as well in doing this research. This is an image from the Baltimore Cactus Journal from 1894. It was a journal devoted to the culture of cacti and succulents based out of Baltimore. And just really quickly, I want to show you something really interesting about this sort of gender dynamics of plants and collection. And it says, this was in their opening issue, it said cactus becoming popular. And it reads, within the last few years, the collecting and cultivating of the cactus seems to have gained so rapidly that it has developed into a perfect craze, and it is astonishing to find that the majority of the admirers of this particular genus of plants are ladies. Now, why is it that they should become so fascinated with the cactus, the majority of them being so difficult to handle on account of their long and dangerous-looking spines? This question may be very easily answered. Ladies are always the best judges of good things. They admire them on account of their beauty, grotesque growth, beautiful flowers, and more particularly their oddity. What prettier picture would one wish to see than a collection of cacti properly arranged to show a contrast in the many-colored spines of the different varieties? And so the article then goes on to talk about how this is becoming a craze. They talk about the cactus maniac or the cactus crank, which is a term that I think we should bring back, as a class of individuals. And they make this point that Baltimore, at least in 1894, purportedly was the leader of this craze. And I just note this, for instance, because this is just to say that there's nothing fixed about sort of gendered relationships with these plants. And at this moment in 1894, at least, it would seem to be that more women than men were fascinated by cacti. And I thought that was quite interesting. I just want to walk you through really quickly sort of then how this sort of work and these interviews and all this social research turned into and developed into this book. My book is spaced out across 8 chapters and an introduction. The first chapter really details what does it mean to collect, who are collectors, and also what does it mean to care for cacti. Um, and this sort of gets into like a lot of my research spent within cactus collecting societies and trying to better understand what motivated people. It also touches on some of these gender dimensions of the trade. The second chapter, I follow a group of cacto explorers to Brazil and engage in various forms of cacto exploration and taking photographs, but also asking questions about the illicit, whether it's about trade in seed or decisions or not to illegally take plants from habitat. The third chapter takes a historical turn and tries to disentangle and understand how and why it is that the Czech Republic became this very important epicenter of illegal cactus trade and why, which is a really fascinating story that I won't delve into in this talk today, but it has a lot to do, for instance, with both Alberto Wojciech Fritsch, but also interestingly, the sort of the Iron Curtain and what happened under communism and what happened after communism to make Czech growers some of the most skilled growers and propagators of cacti in the world. Chapter 4 turns back to Brazil, and I entangle with my own forms of anxiety about extinction as I am watching a species of cactus, Marielena or Arojadoa marielena, on the verge of extinction on the mountain Serra Escura in Brazil. And so I try to contend with what does it mean to be anxious about extinction and what does that do for collectors in terms of thinking about what does it mean to save species. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 then take a big turn because during my research, this new illicit trade emerged in the succulent species Dudleya farinosa and also Dudleya pachyphytum from California for farinosa and pachyphytum from California. And end up changing my research and leaving Mexico to go to California to try to understand this new and emergent form of trade. Unsatisfied by what I find in California and also in Mexico, I end up spending a month in South Korea trying to understand why suddenly it would seem like thousands of Dudleya farinosa were being poached from the California coastline and ending up in South Korea, only to sort of discover that this was just one stop on a much more global journey. It ends up also entangling me with one succulent poacher in particular, Byung-Soo Kim, who The Guardian described as the sort of most notorious cactus smuggler in the world. And then I end the book on chapter 8, trying to think about how do we move beyond sort of just the doom and gloom of thinking about this, but also orient ourselves towards a more what I call a more flourishing geography of succulent life. And that's sort of so the book moves across geographies, but also entangles with dozens and dozens of different kinds of cactus species. So now I just want to also, I want to take a minute to actually try to unpack a little bit when we talk about the illegal wildlife trade in cactus and succulent plants. What does it mean to talk about an illegal cactus? And the first thing to say is that there's no such thing as an illegal cactus, right? With an asterisk about peyote, which I'm not going to get into in this particular talk, which is classed as a class 1 drug, which is the same as heroin in the United States. But when we're talking about the illegal wildlife trade in cacti, what we're really talking about is especially international illegal trade, and the fact that illegality is determined by compliance with linked to national and international trade conventions. And specifically here, we're talking about CITES, which I'm sure most people, but maybe not all people, are familiar with. This is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It is a mouthful. Including cacti, there are over 3,000 species of succulents listed to one of the 3 CITES appendices. I'm going to break those down in the next slide. And with a few exceptions, the entire cactus family is listed on one of the appendices of CITES. All of the cactus family is in fact listed on Appendix 2 unless they're on Appendix 3. Okay. So what is this thing, CITES, for those who are less familiar? Well, it came into effect after being drafted in 1973. It came into effect in 1975. So this is over 50 years old now, making it also one of the largest and oldest conservation conventions in the world. Although I actually want to pause and say that it's really a trade convention, not a conservation convention. We can talk about that more in the Q&A maybe. There are over 38,000 species on CITES today. But as you'll see, the majority of those are actually plants, not animals, even though animals were principally what CITES was first really about and designed for. Most of those plants are orchids because there are a whole lot of orchid species. And we can talk more about why that is if we want to. But I think a lot of folks here are probably aware of that. There are 3 different appendices on CITES. I'm going to not talk about Appendix 3 right now. Appendix 2, though, requires country export permits. So trade is permitted internationally in these plants that are on Appendix 2, but they require export permits. So it's permitted, but it's regulated, we can say. So if you internationally were trading in an Appendix 2 species, but it didn't have CITES export paperwork, you would be engaging in a form of illegal wildlife trade. Okay. Appendix 1 are plants where import and export permits are both required, but all trade is banned except for essentially scientific purposes. You can't get Appendix 1 permits for commercial trade, okay? So if a plant is listed on Appendix 1, you really can't be trading it legally for commercial purposes. It's important to note the entire cactus family is listed on Appendix 1 or 2. So the entire family is listed on Appendix 2, and then certain genera and species are listed on Appendix 1. There are some exceptions, of course, for artificially propagated plants and in tissue culture plants. So how does this work? Well, if you go to CITES.org right now, you can look up very easily the appendices, and you can search for which species are on which appendix. It's actually quite straightforward, as sort of confusing as CITES can seem in many ways. But essentially, CITES is an international agreement between governments, and its aim is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants don't threaten the survival of the species. And so when species are listed as CITES, in principle, the idea is that by listing them, governments can better regulate the impacts of trade on those species and reduce the risk of trade negatively impacting their conservation. This is what it looks like when you look at the appendices. So if you see here under cacti, um, uh, under Appendix 2 on the right-hand column, it says all Cactaceae species. Okay, and then there's a couple of exceptions involving Parescias. But then you can see the species that are listed, for instance, on Appendix 1. For instance, all Eriocarpus cacti are Appendix 1. Okay, so you cannot internationally trade in Eriocarpus. Okay, outside of maybe research purposes. You can see, for instance, Aztekium rideri is another, that's a specific species. So sometimes it's a whole genus, but sometimes it's specific species. All disco cactus, for instance, okay? So if you're not familiar with this and you're buying plants online, especially internationally, I would encourage you to become more familiar with how CITES works and what it means for you in terms of your plant purchasing. Where does the rubber meet the road and where does CITES apply? Well, here's a screenshot I pulled from eBay not that long ago, and I think this is why this matters. Here is a plant that I would describe as pretty suspect and cause for concern without being able to prove unambiguously that this is a scenario involving illegal wildlife trade. However, it probably is. So as you notice, for instance, all Eriocarpus are listed as Appendix 1, right? Here's a plant confusingly listed as Eriocarpus confusus, not a real species, on its own roots and never grafted, and then confusingly also it says no copiopoa. The price is over $300, and the plant was being sold by a seller in Italy. Okay, the plant is not being advertised as coming with CITES permits. It's an Eriocarpus, so it wouldn't be able to have them, or phytosanitary permits. It cautions buyers that while they are willing to sell the plant internationally anywhere that the buyer wants, that the buyer should beware and be aware of international trade regulations and that the seller is not liable if the plant is confiscated. If you were to purchase this plant on eBay today from Italy, you would be complicit in a form of illegal international wildlife trade without question. Okay. Unfortunately, this happens all the time. But I bring this up as an example for those who might be less aware of how easy it is to even inadvertently fall into engaging in forms of illegal wildlife trade, especially through the internet, and especially in the context of international trades. I also think it's interesting here that there's a number of other things that tip me off to this being a concern. So the fact that it also includes copiopoa in the search terms is a tip off. The fact that the plant looks terrible, right, is also suggestive that this plant might be a plant that was harvested from the wild. And the fact that it doesn't really use the true species name, right? This would be probably Eriocarpus retusus, maybe subspecies Trigonomus, or Trigonus, excuse me. I'm not a botanist again, so with apologies if I've got that one wrong, but that's what it looks like to me. So, just by way of a brief interlude, in case folks were interested, there is an app that you can download on your phone called Species Plus that actually makes it really easy or reasonably easy to search any species and quickly discover whether or not, for instance, it's listed on CITES and on what appendix. So here is what the main screen looks like for Species Plus. I, for instance, search in it for Pellicifera. As you can see here, then under Pellicifera, it is listed all genera of all species of Pellicifera genus of cacti are listed on CITES Appendix 1. And I bring this up as a good example because I was recently talking to someone who was saying to me how they had bought a Pellicifera from Germany. However, they assured me and told me that it came with CITES paperwork. And I said, well, that's really, really interesting that you bought it with CITES paperwork, and it's great that you were paying attention to that. But there is no legal CITES paperwork for a Pellicifera for commercial trade because it's an Appendix 1 species. And they were really upset because they basically showed me the paperwork or were telling me about the paperwork, and unambiguously the paperwork was fraudulent. And so this is stuff for people to be aware of and concerned about. Okay. What I next want to turn to, though, is that question that Erwin brought up about this thing in terms of thinking about desire and how I saw desire playing out in this research. And just by one way of quick example, I saw and how this then turned my research in terms of thinking about some of the conservation ethics that this brings up. I'll use the example of Mammillaria bertholdii. Here's a plant that a lot of people are probably familiar with, more recently described, I mean, about 10 years ago now in the botanical literature, discovered by self-described German cacto explorer Andreas Berthold in 2013, and then formally described by Thomas Linzen. Um, you know, this is a plant that made a big splash when it was first described. Really unusual mammillaria, these interesting pectinate, leaves, gorgeous flower, really restricted habitat. Basically, as soon as it was discovered, it was already, considered imminently endangered and threatened. And yet, at the same time that it was described in the literature, already you could buy seeds and small grafted plants of mammillaria for sale online and at cactus conventions in Europe. And it was unambiguous that this plant was illegally smuggled out of Mexico years before the species was formally described in the literature. Several years ago, you could even find this plant for selling for over $1,000 or more per individual grafted plant. The first seeds were being sold out of the Czech Republic for $50 for about 10 seeds. And now one of the greatest threats that the species faces is from illegal wild collection of the plant for the illegal horticultural trade. And it's interesting to note that when Thomas Linzen first described the species, he said, undoubtedly, we are the biggest threat, meaning hobbyists and collectors, to Mammillaria bertholdii at the site, all enthusiasts who think they are. It's this urge, this craving to possess everything that is new and still has the appearance of the unusual, right? So it's worth dwelling here and thinking about how this is about more than economy, right? This is also about this deeper question about what desire is and what desire indexes and signifies for us. What's also interesting, though, is to think about the pragmatics of what happens when we make when these trades are illegal and what happens in the sort of psyche of the collector. So within a matter of years, as expensive as Mammillaria bertholdii first was, the price for this cactus fell to just $5 to $25 for grafted plants. The people who first stole Mammillaria bertholdii out of Mexico told me one day as I toured yet another world-class collection of cacti in the Czech Republic that they were responsible for this price crash, and that by providing cultivated plants in seed for the market, they were averting a rush of collectors seeking out wild-growing plants in Oaxaca. As one of the collectors said to me, if not for us, this plant might already be extinct in the wild, and yet we are made out as the criminals. So all of this was illegal, however, and took place to the consternation of Mexican authorities who have never granted export permits for Mammillaria bertholdii or its seeds. A question emerges then for us. How seriously should we take the poacher who is aware that their activities are illegal, like this Czech dealer, but justifies them on a moral ethical ground of averting greater harm to the species by doing nothing at all? And so one of the things that I try to develop and think through in the book is what I call the archetype of the Robin Hood conservationist. Are these Czech dealers, for instance, the international plant poachers that the Mexican authorities make them out to be, and that on paper they are for breaking international trade regulations and trade rules? Or are they doing something else here? Are they answering to a kind of higher moral authority when they say, if not for us, this plant might already be extinct in the wild, and yet we are made out as criminals? How do we understand that dynamic? And one way to do that is to think about this sort of framing of what I call the modus operandi of the Robin Hood conservationist. In the way they see it, the laws and trade regulations of CITES, even if they're well-intentioned, they see them as wrong. And so they answer to a higher moral authority as being justified as an act of species care. Caring here for the species means ensuring that plants can circulate globally to all the collectors who are desirous of this plant. For them, then, causing some level of harm is justified to circulate material. We could think about this as being essentially a form of the ends justify the means. And ultimately, this comes down to this theory or idea of flooding the market, which some people might be familiar with. This idea that by stealing some material, they're able to germinate seeds and propagate plants. And by doing that, they were able to crash the market for more expensive wild harvested plants. Okay. Now, I'm not going to tell you whether or not I think that this is necessarily true. I think that there's a sense that this is a place that we actually need a lot more research. We need counterfactuals to be able to actually understand, is this a technique that actually successfully floods the market by producing and culturing plants and putting them out into the market, as some people are aware of? Does that actually reduce prices? And does that hinder people from illegally harvesting wild traded plants? This is a really urgent research question. There are some small studies that have suggested that it does work, but there's others from other taxa like orchids that are more uncertain about that. Okay. But moving beyond this kind of pragmatic form of conservation, even if it's illegal, that these check collectors seem to purport to practice, and that's all well and good. I also think there's something more going on here in terms of thinking about this desire. Okay, so this led me to thinking about desire and the emotions that emerge between people and plants that make these plants so irresistibly needed to be possessed and to have in collection. Okay. One of the things I just want to dwell really quickly on then is, what do I mean when I say desire? And part of what I do in the book is actually turn to psychoanalytic frameworks to try to understand that desire is something more than naming what we want. And so a lot of people might be familiar, for instance, with Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire, which I think is a really great book. But I also think he misses the mark here because he doesn't really unpack what desire really is. Desire, for instance, in the way that I think about it through a more psychoanalytic framing, is about more than what we want. It's about this sense of lack in this impossible quest to be unified with what we as desiring subjects suppose is lacking within our very being. This sense of lack, though, is a fantasy. And it's this fantasy, though, that upholds desire, that structures our desire and how we move out into the world as constantly desiring subjects, constantly out in the world looking for things that we might imagine are going to deliver a form of total satisfaction or complete our collections of cacti, for instance. And so a lot of what I found in this research was that there was this sense of lack that sort of centered a lot of these questions. Oh, if I could only get this new plant or this one species that I don't have of this one genera. So I'm not going to dwell too long in that kind of theoretical realm, but I wanted to say that part of what I was doing in this research was paying attention to forms of objects of desire and how they structured people's desires and how they moved out into the world. Okay. And by one way of example, I want to tell one quick story. And this is one I share in chapter 2 of my book on looking for the last. And this is a story about looking for a species of cactus, Ubulmania buningii, and it comes from Brazil. And I was with a group of cacto explorers in Brazil, and we went to go to one place where this cactus, Ubulmania buningii, was known to grow. Our guide had been there several years before, and there had been hundreds and hundreds of Ubulmania buningii. We went to this site, and it was full of, this really otherworldly site of quartz substrate and these Pilosocerius plants, really outstanding landscape. But after several hours of looking in this location where just a few years ago, the guide had seen hundreds of Ubulmania buningii, this really beautiful kind of purplish Ubulmania, we found none. And very quickly, the feeling of the trip became really depressing and sad because, as the guide explained to us, what was causing this absence was illegal collection by passionate collectors who were visiting the site year after year. and maybe just taking one plant or two plants, but slowly over time, enough plants were absent that there wasn't seed recruitment in the soil, and these plants were slowly going extinct. But this was one of only two known sites left for this particular species of Ubelmania. We were actually contending with what would it actually mean for this plant to be going extinct because of illegal collection, because of this desire to see this plant and what moved all of us to being there. Just before we left the site, after having this kind of very heavy conversation about this tension and these contradictions between the love of these species, but the fact that this love seemingly was causing these plants to go into extinction, out of the corner of my eye, I caught this color of purple and actually discovered this one tiny Ubelmania buningii. And this is a much younger pre-pandemic version of me. And I'm hoping you can see in the bottom, if you follow the look of my eye, there's this tiny little cactus, haloed in white, this purplish cactus. Um, and this moment was full of such immense joy. I almost cried. It's really kind of embarrassing, but I was so moved by this experience of finding this last of this species. It had this enormous and profound impact on me. And it's an enormous and profound emotional impact that I would have never had I not been there with these men who were so passionate about cacti and so passionate about seeking out these plants. If I had just encountered it on my own, I would have thought, oh, that's a cool cactus. I didn't know I hadn't learned how to care for it. I hadn't learned how to love it. And one of the ways of doing that was by spending time with people like cactus and succulent collectors who are really passionate about these plants. So after sort of a really exciting moment in which I was congratulated by the group I was with, we had this interesting moment in which one of the collectors I was with said, the strange psychology of collectors in this hobby is that some people would now say, okay, this is the last one, and we should take it home to protect it. Plenty of people would say that. And I found this thought so fascinating that both that he was aware of this sense, but that he had to actively resist this urge to take the last of this species home, purportedly to protect it, while at the same time knowing that the reason that this plant was absent and going extinct was because other collectors had been to the site before us thinking the same thing, that by taking the plant out of habitat, they were doing the work of saving the species. And so one of the things I try to do in this book is sort of think through that idea about what does it mean to save? What does it mean to save plants? And what does it mean to think about saving these plants in our collections? There are some criminologists named Mackenzie and Yates who write really brilliantly about this idea of saving in collectors. Here they're actually writing about antiquities, but it applies, I think, to the world of cacti as well. On the surface, the argument is that to acquire them saves them from destruction. There is, however, another type of saving. The collector saves the object from obscurity. Yet even if they did not need the collector to save them from potential destruction, such as Ubelmania buningii, there's a strong sense in the collecting narrative that they deserve to be appreciated. They deserve to be loved. And in this sense, the collector offers salvation. And I think that's such a brilliant way of thinking about these weird and seemingly contradictory tensions between this desire to love, this desire to protect, and this desire to save, even when the actual actions of purportedly saving them are the very thing that causes them to actually lead to diminution and even extinction in the extreme form, as we found with the Ubelmania buningii. I want to end today just by sharing a little bit about kind of some of the results that I gathered from the survey work that I did. Is that okay, Erwin, or am I out of time?
Sure, go on.
Okay, I'll be really quick. Sorry for taking a little bit too long, maybe. But just because a lot of people on this call may have actually taken the survey, and so I think it's important to share some of these results. I'm happy to share this. This is an open access paper, so you're welcome to look it up and look at it on your own time if you want to. It is a scientific paper, but I can also, link to an article that kind of explains it in broader terms. But one of the things I just wanted to point out really quickly is that in our survey of cactus collectors, the vast majority of collectors both think that the illegal collection of wild plants is a serious problem in the trade, that it's an increasing problem, and that at the same time, the cactus and succulent collector community has a really important role to play in plant conservation efforts. Okay, so what I saw here in these survey results is a really serious concern within the hobby about illegal wildlife trade of cacti and succulents, and a desire to want to do things about it within the hobby. And I think that's fabulous. In terms of looking at acceptability of behaviors, very quickly we find that most of the behaviors associated with illegal wildlife trade are not seen as acceptable by most people. Okay. For instance, collecting of endangered or threatened cacti, collecting wild cactus and succulent plants. We do find about a 50-50 split on the collection of seeds, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if we want to. As folks may know, for instance, the international trade in Mexican cactus seeds is also registered on CITES and requires trade paperwork. That is not as much the case for other countries. But we can talk about the impacts of illegal wildlife trade in seeds as well. At the same time, we found in this study that about 10 to 15% of those surveyed in the survey engaged in some form of illegal behavior in illegal wildlife trade. So as much as people were concerned about this, it's also an activity that does pervade in the hobby, even if it's a minority of people. We found that younger people and men were more likely to report buying a plant without required paperwork, and that older people, professional growers, and respondents with higher reported knowledge of CITES were actually more likely to report personally transporting a plant across an international border without paperwork. Okay. That means that those with more CITES awareness and awareness of trade regulations were actually more likely to engage in forms of illegal wildlife trade than those people without. Okay. We also found that men and professional growers were more likely to report shipping a plant across an international border without required paperwork. And that's especially concerning. This means that the people who are probably most aware of international trade regulations may be most implicated in being involved in illegal wildlife trade. And this was a quite concerning finding. One of the things we also found, though, is that most collectors play by the rules, but those who do break the rules often do so knowingly. It's important to note that 90% of our sample or so did not report breaking CITES regulations, but the involvement of professionals in the most involved non-compliant activities suggests that people do break these rules knowing that they're doing so, and we can talk about that. One of the last things I will point to, though, is that collectors, while they were really aware and worried about illegal wildlife trade, were much more likely to blame others rather than themselves for illegal wildlife trade. And here what I mean is most of our sample came from North America and Europe, but most of the blame in open text responses placed the blame at the feet of East Asian collectors rather than recognizing that illegal wildlife trade is taking place within our own communities as well. And I think that's something for us to engage with. We did find that it was gendered as well, where more men, for instance, than women were often engaged in forms of illegal activity. To end, I just want to sort of say, I think this leads us to thinking about, are things getting better or are they getting worse? And we can talk about this as well, right? You know, and I want to leave us with a couple of different thoughts. This is a press release that just came out yesterday. For folks who aren't aware of it, there's a really great organization called conservationlitigation.org, run by Jacob Phelps out of Lancaster University in the UK, that's actively working with lawyers to try to bring cases for the environment to courts. And right now, a lot of people are probably familiar with the big case that was written about in the New York Times involving copia-poa theft. That case is finally having its day in court in Italy. Actually today, or maybe it was yesterday, this court in Italy is going to hear this case against these poachers who smuggled some of the most threatened cacti, these copia-poa, from Chile's Atacama Desert. And this is really exciting. I think this is an important signal that lawyers and environmental lawyers are starting to take more seriously these forms of illegal wildlife trade, and people are going to be held to account, right? So this is good news. There's also bad news, right? And as a lot of people are probably familiar with, the illicit succulent trade in South Africa is really, really bad right now. And I would say that we're actually dealing with a bit of a crisis. And actually some of my ongoing work is going to be looking more at what's happening in South Africa and finding ways of responding to it that are oriented towards social justice as well. How can we respond to curbing these forms of illegal wildlife trade that doesn't just focus on criminalization, but actually focuses on empowering communities, okay? I'm going to skip this slide because I think I've already kind of hit on these points, but I just want to sort of share that I think that for me, paying attention to desire offered insights into what can appear as contradictory behaviors within the plant collecting community, and that prohibition as an impulse to save species or completely stopping trade may not always lead towards the most effective conservation outcomes. And I think we need to think creatively about how it is that we do the best conservation work. And I'm really excited about opportunities to engage with the sort of hobbyist and collector community in fostering more just, sustainable conservation opportunities for sort of allowing people to sort of follow their desires in caring for plants and cultivating plants, but making sure that we're not doing harm to the species in the process. In terms of what's next for me, as I mentioned, I'm conducting transnational research now with colleagues in South Africa and South Korea, funded by the UK DEFRA Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund on the South African succulent poaching crisis. And I'm also a 2024 National Geographic Explorer, focusing on new research on the carnivorous illicit plant trade, focused on the Venus flytrap from North Carolina. So thank you all so much for your time. I'm going to stop there, and apologies if I went a little too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.